There is a moment, somewhere around 40,000 years ago, when the last of them disappeared. Not all at once. Not in a single fire or a single season of dying. One by one. Across different continents and different centuries. The other kinds of human beings, who had shared this world with us, went quiet. And we were left alone. We have been alone so long that we forgot, for most of recorded history, that we ever had company. This is the story of the others. The word human is used in this telling in a broad narrative sense, to honor the reality that what we find in the evidence, the burials, the tools, the pigment on cave walls, points toward beings whose lives had weight and texture and consequence. It is not used to erase the real biological differences between Homo sapiens and other hominin lineages. Both things can be true at once. Not monsters. Not primitives shuffling through the dark without thought or feeling. Beings who built fires and buried their dead and looked up at the same stars you are lying under right now. Beings who grieved and healed and made things with their hands that have survived long enough for us to hold. They are not entirely gone. Some of them live on, in the quietest possible way. Inside you, in the architecture of your immune system, in the way your body handles cold, in gene variants you carry without knowing, passed down across 100,000 years from a meeting between two kinds of human beings who recognized something in each other and came close enough to leave a mark that neither of them could have imagined would last. Settle in. Let your breathing slow. You do not need to hold on to anything tonight. If sleep takes you somewhere in the middle of this, that is perfectly fine. The story will carry you. And you can return to it another night. The past is deep tonight. Patient and wide and full of faces we are only beginning to recognize. We were not always alone. And understanding that changes everything about what it means to be human. Chapter 1. The World Before Alone. Start with the world as it actually was, not the world we were taught in school, where human history begins with us, with Homo sapiens, as though the stage was empty until we walked onto it and everything before was mere prelude. That version of the story is understandable. It is the version you get when the only evidence you have is fragmentary and old and buried under thousands of years of geology and silence. But it is not the complete version. And the complete version is considerably stranger and more beautiful than the simplified one. Go back roughly 300,000 years. That is approximately when anatomically modern Homo sapiens first appears in the fossil record. Most clearly at a site called Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, where researchers from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, publishing in the journal Nature in 2017, describe skulls and teeth and stone tools that push the known origin of our species back by roughly 100,000 years beyond previous estimates. 300,000 years is a long time. It is so long that it resists honest comprehension. If you compress the entire history of Homo sapiens into a single 24-hour day, the period we think of as human civilization, the last 10,000 years of agriculture and cities and writing and everything that followed, would occupy only the final 48 seconds before midnight. But here is the thing about those 300,000 years. For most of them, we were not alone. When Homo sapiens first appeared in Africa, Neanderthals had already been living across Europe and Western Asia for a very long time. Estimates of when the Neanderthal lineage begins vary among researchers depending on which anatomical features they use to define it, with ranges spanning from roughly 200,000 to 400,000 years or more. What is not disputed is the scale of their presence. They had survived ice ages. They had adapted to climates ranging from the cold steppe of northern Europe to the warmer landscapes of the Levant. They had been doing what humans do, making tools, feeding their families, burying their dead, for longer than our species had existed. In the forests and hills of what is now Indonesia, A small-bodied hominin we now call Homo floresiensis was living on the island of Flores. Isolated by ocean crossings that should have been impossible and yet somehow were not. In the caves of Siberia and across a vast arc of Central and Eastern Asia, a group we did not know existed until 2010, the Denisovans, were leaving traces so subtle that it took DNA extracted from a fragment of finger bone to reveal them to us. And in the Philippines, on the island of Luzon, a third island-dwelling hominin that we named Homo luzonensis only in 2019 was living in ways we still barely understand. This was the actual world, not a world with one kind of human being at the center of everything. A world with several. A world where the question of what it meant to be human did not have a single answer. Because the answer depended on which valley you were standing in and which kind of being was standing next to you. To understand why this matters, you have to let go of a particular assumption that modern life makes very easy to hold without noticing. The assumption is that Homo sapiens is the finished product, the endpoint, the thing that evolution was building toward all along, and that all the earlier hominins were simply failed drafts of. That assumption is wrong in a way that is not merely technical. It is wrong in a way that distorts how we understand ourselves. Evolution does not build toward anything. It does not have a direction or a goal or a preferred outcome. It produces variation, and variation survives or does not survive based on the specific conditions of specific environments at specific moments in time. Homo sapiens survived. The Neanderthals, the Denisovans, Homo floresiensis, and Homo luzonensis did not, or did not survive as distinct lineages. But that outcome was not inevitable. It was contingent. It depended on circumstances that could have been otherwise. And the species that survived was shaped, in ways we are still measuring, by the ones that did not. Now, think about what the world looked like 60,000 years ago. The period when Homo sapiens was beginning to expand out of Africa into territories that other hominins already occupied. The planet was in the grip of the last ice age. Sea levels were lower than they are today. In some places, by more than 300 feet. Which means that coastlines and land bridges existed that have since been swallowed by rising water. Forests and grasslands and river systems that no longer exist stretched across landscapes that are now desert or ocean floor. The world was colder, drear, and in many regions emptier of people than anything we can easily imagine standing in a city in the 21st century. But it was not empty. In Europe, Neanderthals had lived for so long that their traditions of tool-making had gone through multiple technological revolutions. The tool industry we call the Mousterian, named for a site in the Dordogne Valley of France, had produced stone points and scrapers of real sophistication. Tools designed with enough understanding of how stone fractures to require genuine skill and planning. In the caves of what is now Spain and Croatia, Neanderthals had been engaging in behaviors that, when the evidence was first presented to the scientific community, generated serious resistance. Not because the evidence was weak, because the behaviors were too recognizably human for the existing story about Neanderthals to accommodate. The discomfort that evidence produced tells you something important. It tells you that our understanding of who the others were has always been shaped by what we needed them to be. For most of the history of paleoanthropology, we needed the Neanderthals to be lesser, to be the failed draft that proved we were the finished product. When the evidence stopped cooperating with that need, the story had to change. It is still changing. And every change brings us closer to something that is both humbling and, if you sit with it long enough, quietly wonderful. The world that produced us was not a world of one. It was a world of several. A world of experiment and variation, and multiple answers to the question of how a large-brained, upright walking, socially complex primate could survive. Most of those answers ended. One of them became you, but you carry the others with you. in ways that are measurable, documented, and real. The species that shared this world with your ancestors left something of themselves behind before they disappeared. The story of what they left, and what it means that they left it, is the story this night is going to tell. Before we meet them one by one, there is one more thing worth sitting with in the dark. The question of what makes something human is not a question that science can fully answer. Science can tell you about brain volume and skeletal morphology and the presence or absence of a hyoid bone that might have supported speech. It can tell you about tool traditions and burial practices and the isotope ratios in ancient teeth that reveal what a being ate and where they grew up. It can read genomes from bones that have been in the ground for 50,000 years and find within them the signatures of who mated with whom and what genes passed from one lineage to another. All of that is extraordinary. All of it matters. But the question of whether the Neanderthal individual, who was buried with apparent care in a cave in what is now Iraq, experienced something we would recognize as grief, or was grieved by someone who experienced something we would recognize as love. That question sits at the edge of what the instruments can reach. And it is the question that, when you really let it land, changes everything. Because if the answer is yes, even partially, yes, then the story of what was lost when the last Neanderthal and the last Denisovan and the last small-bodied hominin on Flores drew their final breath is not just a story about evolutionary biology. It is a story about the scale of loss that time is capable of. A loss that has no monument, no written record, no name we can pronounce, only the quiet fact of absence. And the genes we carry, and the growing understanding that the world before we were alone was a richer and more complicated place than we ever imagined it could be. Let that settle. Let your breathing slow a little more. We are going to meet them now, un by un, in the order that the evidence allows, and by the time the story is done, you may find that the word human means something slightly larger than it did when you lay down tonight. Chapter 2. The Neanderthals, the cousins we misread. There is a skeleton in a museum in Bonn, Germany, that changed the way human beings understood themselves. It was found in 1856, 3 years before Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species, in a limestone gorge called the Neander Valley, which in German is Neanderthal. Workers quarrying the cave had tossed the bones aside before a local schoolteacher named Johann Karl Fuhlrott recognized that they were something unusual. The skullcap was thick and heavy, with pronounced brow ridges unlike anything in the modern human range. The limb bones were robust and curved in ways that suggested extraordinary physical strength. Fuhlrott brought the bones to an anatomist named Hermann Schaffhausen. Together, they proposed something that most of the scientific establishment of 1856 was not prepared to accept. The bones were old, very old, and they belonged to something that was not quite like us. The resistance was immediate. The geologist Rudolf Virchow, one of the most influential scientists in Europe, examined the bones and concluded they belonged to a modern human who had suffered from rickets and arthritis and had been beaten so severely over his lifetime that his bones had deformed. The idea that the bones represented an earlier form of human being was, to Virchow and many of his contemporaries, not a scientific conclusion, but a philosophical provocation. It implied that humanity had a prehistory that did not begin with the story they had been told. That resistance shaped the image of Neanderthals that persisted for over a century. In 1911, a French paleontologist named Marcelin Boulay published a detailed reconstruction of a Neanderthal skeleton found at La Chapelle aux Saints in France. Boulay's reconstruction depicted a creature that was stooped, brutish, and barely capable of upright walking, with a forward-jutting head and bent knees that suggested something more ape than human. This image became the popular picture of Neanderthals for generations. It appeared in textbooks and museum dioramas and popular illustrations. It became so embedded in the cultural imagination that the word Neanderthal itself became an insult, a shorthand for stupidity and crudeness. There was one problem with Boulet's reconstruction. It was wrong. The skeleton from La Chapelle aux Saints belonged to an elderly individual who had suffered from severe arthritis, which had affected posture and the wear on the joints. Boulet had misread the pathological condition of one individual as the typical anatomy of an entire species. Later researchers, re-examining the same bones, found that a healthy Neanderthal walked fully upright, with a posture and gait not dramatically different from our own. The stooped cave brute was a projection, a story the bones had been made to tell because the people reading them needed that story to be true. The actual Neanderthals were something else entirely. Begin with their physical reality. Because the physical reality is impressive on its own terms. Neanderthals were stocky and heavily muscled, adapted to the cold environments of Ice Age Europe in ways that gave them a body plan optimized for heat retention. Their average brain volume was comparable to ours, and in some specimens, slightly larger. Though brain size alone tells you little about cognitive capacity. Their hands had the same basic structure as ours, with a precision grip capable of fine manipulation. Studies of Neanderthal hand bones published in 2018 by researchers including Katarina Harvati of the University of Tübingen found evidence of the same pad-to-pad fingertip contact that modern humans use for delicate tasks, suggesting that Neanderthal hands were capable of the kind of controlled, precise movement that complex manual activities require. Their tools reflect that capacity. The Mousterian tool industry involved the production of stone flakes from carefully prepared cores, a technique that requires planning several steps ahead, visualizing the final shape of a tool before the first strike is made. More recent evidence has connected some Neanderthal groups to an even more sophisticated tool tradition called the Châtel-Perronian, found in sites in France and Spain, which includes blades, bone tools, and personal ornaments. The debate over whether Neanderthals developed the Châtel-Perronian independently or through contact with arriving Homo sapiens has not been fully resolved. But the objects themselves are real, and they are not the products of a species operating at the edge of cognitive competence. Then there is the evidence that generated the most resistance, and that has ultimately proven the most significant. Neanderthals buried their dead. This is not a trivial observation. Burial of the dead is one of the behaviors most strongly associated with what we call symbolic thinking, the capacity to understand that a being continues to matter after their body has stopped functioning, to perform actions whose meaning is not immediately practical but refers to something beyond the material present. When you bury someone, you are making a claim about meaning. Neanderthal burials have been documented at multiple sites across Europe and Western Asia. At Shanidar Cave, in what is now northern Iraq. Excavations, led by Ralph Selecki of Columbia University in the 1950s and 60s, uncovered the remains of at least 10 Neanderthal individuals, several of whom appeared to have been deliberately buried. But it is one individual at Shanidar who stays with you, the one researchers call Shanidar 1. He was an adult male, and his bones tell a story that is difficult to set aside once you have heard it. His right arm had been withered, possibly from a birth defect or an early injury, and had been that way for most of his life. He had healed fractures across his body. He showed evidence of severe arthritis in his joints. There are signs of a blow to the left side of his head that may have caused partial blindness and possibly affected his hearing. He survived to what was, for Neanderthal, old age. Think about what that means. He could not have contributed fully to the hunt. He could not have carried heavy loads or kept pace on long foraging trips. In the brutal calculus of survival in the Ice Age landscape, he was, by any purely functional measure, a burden. And yet his community kept him alive. Someone fed him across years of his diminished capacity. Someone protected him. Someone decided, in the daily arithmetic of a life lived close to the edge of survival, that he was worth keeping. That decision is a fact written in bone. What it meant to the beings who made it, what feelings accompanied it across the years of his dependence, is lost. But the decision itself is not lost. More recent excavations at Shanidar, resumed by a team from the University of Cambridge and published in 2020, uncovered an additional Neanderthal burial with what the researchers described as evidence of deliberate placement of the body, adding new weight to the interpretation of intentional burial at the site. At La Forêt in the Dordogne region of France, 8 Neanderthal individuals were found in what appears to be a deliberate burial site, including adults and children. The accumulation of this evidence across multiple sites and multiple continents has shifted the scientific consensus. The majority of researchers now accept that Neanderthals did intentionally bury at least some of their dead, at least some of the time. What that practice meant to them, what beliefs or feelings it may have expressed, remains beyond the reach of the evidence. But the practice itself is documented. And then there is the question of art. In 2018, a team led by Dirk Hoffman of the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology published results in the journal Science from uranium thorium dating of cave markings in 3 Spanish caves, La Pasija, Maltravieso, and Ardalis. The dates they obtained were striking. Some of the markings in those caves were at least 65,000 years old. Homo sapiens did not arrive in Europe until roughly 40,000 to 45,000 years ago. The markings predate our arrival by 20,000 years. The only hominins in Europe 65,000 years ago were Neanderthals. The paper generated immediate debate. Some researchers questioned the dating methodology. Others argued that the uranium thorium method could produce anomalous results under certain conditions. The scientific conversation has continued, and subsequent work has supported the original findings. Additional evidence of Neanderthal symbolic behavior has accumulated from other sources. At Cueva de los Aviones in Spain, pierced shells and shells containing pigment residue were found in deposits dated to more than 115,000 years ago, deep in the Neanderthal period. At multiple sites, eagle talons with cut marks have been found in Neanderthal contexts, which some researchers interpret as evidence of ornament making. Though the interpretation remains debated, these objects do not prove that Neanderthals had language, or religion, or an inner life identical to our own. What the accumulating evidence suggests is that the old story, the story of the brutish and cognitively limited cave dweller incapable of abstract thought, is not supported by what has been found over the past 30 years. The Neanderthals were not us. They were something related to us, and different from us, in ways that are genuinely interesting and genuinely difficult to characterize. Their cognitive world was not identical to ours, but it was not empty. Now come to the most intimate evidence of all. In 2010, a team led by Svante Pääbo at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology published a draft sequence of the Neanderthal genome in the journal Science. The work had taken years and required the development of new techniques for extracting and sequencing ancient DNA from bones that had been in the ground for tens of thousands of years. The finding that emerged was one of the most significant results in the history of human evolutionary science. People of non-African ancestry carry, on average, between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA in their genomes. The explanation for this is interbreeding. At some point during the expansion of Homo sapiens out of Africa and into the territories Neanderthals occupied, the two groups encountered each other and, at least some of the time, had children together. Those children had children, and those lineages, carrying a mixture of Homo sapiens and Neanderthal ancestry, eventually became the ancestors of everyone alive today outside of sub-Saharan Africa. The genetic signal of those encounters is still with us. Svante Pääbo received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2022 for this work and for the broader field of ancient genomics he helped create. The Nobel Committee described his achievements as providing access to genetic information about extinct human relatives and what sets us apart from them. The specific Neanderthal gene variants that survive in modern human genomes are not random. Natural selection has been at work on the Neanderthal portions of our genomes for the tens of thousands of years since the interbreeding occurred, retaining the variants that were useful and removing the ones that were not. Researchers, including Tony Capra of the University of California, San Francisco, and David Reich of Harvard Medical School, have identified Neanderthal-derived gene variants associated with immune function, keratin production in skin and hair, blood clotting, and response to ultraviolet radiation. Some of these variants may have helped Homo sapiens populations adapt to environments that Neanderthals had already been living in for hundreds of thousands of years. The Neanderthals were already adapted to those environments, and their genes, passed into the Homo sapiens lineage, may have helped us survive the world they already knew. They gave us something useful before they disappeared. And then, sometime around 40,000 years ago, they were gone. The last populations appear to have held out in refugia in southwestern Europe, the Iberian Peninsula, Gibraltar. The site of Gorham's Cave in Gibraltar has yielded Neanderthal remains dated to approximately 28,000 years ago, though researchers continue to discuss whether those dates represent the very last Neanderthals or an isolated population already separated from the main range. What the evidence does not show is a single dramatic extinction event. The Neanderthals faded. Their populations shrank. The gaps between groups grew wider. And at some point, the last of them died without leaving a Neanderthal descendant. But not without leaving something. The next time you fight off an infection, the immune response that protects you may be running, in part, on code that was written in a Neanderthal body long before your ancestors ever left Africa. The next time you sit in the cold and your body regulates its temperature with quiet efficiency, a Neanderthal gene variant may be part of what is doing that work. They are not gone. They are quieter than they were. But they are not entirely gone. Chapter 3. The Denisovans, the species we found in a finger. In the summer of 2008, a researcher named Alexander Tsaibankov was excavating a layer of sediment in a cave in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia when he found a small fragment of bone. It was unremarkable in appearance, brownish, about 3 centimeters long, clearly from a finger, almost certainly from a child based on its size. The cave where he found it, known as Denisova Cave, had been excavated intermittently for decades and had yielded stone tools and animal bones and occasional human remains spanning an enormous range of time. One more fragment of bone was not, in the ordinary course of things, a reason for unusual excitement. The bone was catalogued, stored, and eventually sent to the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany, where Svante Pääbo's laboratory had developed techniques for extracting and sequencing ancient DNA from fragmentary remains. What happened next was one of the most extraordinary moments in the history of science. The DNA in that finger bone did not match Homo sapiens. It did not match Neanderthal. It matched something else entirely. Something that had never been described before. Something that had no name, no skeleton, no place in any existing account of human evolution. Because no one had known it existed. The results were published in 2010 in the journal Nature. The authors, a team led by Johannes Krauss and Svante Pääbo, described a previously unknown hominin that had lived in Denisova Cave at the same time Neanderthals and, later, Homo sapiens also occupied the site. They named the new group after the cave, Denisovans. The scientific world had discovered a new branch of the human family tree. Not from a skull, not from a jaw, not from any of the anatomical evidence that paleoanthropology had relied on for over a century and a half. From a fragment of a child's finger. This is worth pausing on, because it represents something genuinely new in the history of how we understand human evolution. For most of that history, the existence of a hominin species required physical remains substantial enough to reconstruct anatomy. The Denisovans violated that requirement entirely. They were identified, named, and placed in the human family tree on the basis of genetic evidence alone. We knew their genome before we knew what they looked like. We knew who they mated with before we knew the shape of their faces. The concept of a genome before skeleton species was new. It was unsettling in a productive way. It forced a rethinking of what discovery meant in paleoanthropology, and it opened questions about how many other hominins might be waiting to be found not in caves but in the genomes of their living descendants. What the genome revealed about the Denisovans was striking. They were more closely related to Neanderthals than to Homo sapiens, sharing a common ancestor with Neanderthals, perhaps 400,000 years ago. While the common ancestor of both Neanderthals and Denisovans with Homo sapiens was older still, they had lived across an enormous geographic range, from Siberia in the north to what is now Southeast Asia and the Pacific in the south. And they had, like the Neanderthals, interbred with Homo sapiens. But the Denisovan interbreeding story has a geography completely different from the Neanderthal one. And that geography tells a remarkable story about human movement across the ancient world. The populations that carry the highest levels of Denisovan ancestry today are not in Siberia, near the cave where the Denisovans were first identified. They are in Melanesia, the island region of the southwest Pacific that includes Papua New Guinea and the surrounding archipelagos. And among the Aboriginal peoples of Australia, researchers, including David Reich at Harvard and Mark Stoneking at the Max Planck Institute, have found that some Melanesian populations carry between 4 and 6% Denisovan ancestry in their genomes. The implication is that the ancestors of modern Melanesians and Australians, moving through island Southeast Asia on their way to the Pacific, encountered Denisovan populations and had children with them. This must have happened somewhere in Asia or Southeast Asia, at a time when the sea levels were lower and the island chains of what is now Indonesia were at least partially connected by land. Exactly where this encounter happened remains one of the open questions of ancient genomics. But the genetic signal is clear. Then there is the Tibetan Plateau. The Tibetan Plateau sits at an average elevation of more than 14,000 feet above sea level. At that altitude, the air contains roughly 60% of the oxygen available at sea level. For most human populations, living at such altitudes causes a condition called chronic mountain sickness, in which the body overproduces red blood cells in an attempt to compensate for low oxygen, eventually thickening the blood in ways that create serious health risks. Tibetan populations, who have lived at high altitude for thousands of years, are largely protected from this, and the genetic variant that protects them came from Denisovans. This finding, published in 2014 in the journal Nature by a team including Rasmus Nielsen of the University of California, Berkeley, and Emilia Huerta Sanchez, represents one of the clearest examples of adaptive gene flow across hominin lineages ever documented. The Denisovans, living across the vast terrain of Asia for hundreds of thousands of years, had developed through natural selection a version of a gene called EPAS, one that allowed them to function at high altitude. When the ancestors of modern Tibetans interbred with Denisovans, they acquired that variant, and natural selection maintained it across the thousands of years since. Because in the specific environment of the Tibetan Plateau, it worked. The Denisovans are not alive, but their solution to the problem of living at altitude is alive, running in the bodies of millions of people on the Tibetan Plateau every day. This may have made long-term settlement of the plateau much more viable than it would have been otherwise. The physical remains of the Denisovans that have been identified with confidence are remarkably few. The original finger bone fragment from 2008. Several teeth. Large and unusual in shape. Different enough from both Homo sapiens and Neanderthal teeth to be diagnostically distinct. A fragment of a lower jaw found in a cave in Shahe in the Tibetan Plateau. Identified as Denisovan in 2019 when protein analysis of the bone's collagen connected it to the Denisovan lineage. And, in 2023, a team led by Katarina Duca of the Max Planck Institute, publishing in the journal Nature, Ecology and Evolution, reported on skeletal fragments from Baixia Karst Cave in China that show evidence of Denisovan occupation over an extended period. The Xiahe jaw was found at an altitude of over 10,000 feet. The Denisovans were not visitors to the plateau. They were residents, and the physiological adaptation they developed there eventually passed, through interbreeding, to the people who came after them. Denisova Cave itself has provided one more discovery that crystallizes, perhaps better than anything else, the complexity of the world that existed before Homo sapiens was alone. In 2018, a team led by Viviane Slan and Svante Paabo at the Max Planck Institute announced the analysis of a bone fragment found in the cave, catalogued as Denisova 11. The results were published in Nature. The individual whose bone it was, a girl who had died sometime in her teenage years, was the direct offspring of a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father. She was, as far as the evidence goes, a first-generation hybrid, the child of parents who belonged to two different hominin lineages that had diverged from each other hundreds of thousands of years before her birth. The researchers named her Deni. Deni lived in Denisova Cave approximately 90,000 years ago. Her genome showed that her Neanderthal mother was more closely related to Neanderthals found in Western Europe than to those from the Altai region where the cave is located, which implies that Neanderthal populations were moving across large distances. Her Denisovan father carried in his own genome traces of Neanderthal ancestry from an even earlier period of interbreeding, one that had occurred hundreds of thousands of years before Deni was born. She was not simply the product of two lineages meeting. She was the product of a world in which those lineages had been meeting, separating, and meeting again across an almost incomprehensible span of time. One child, in one cave, 90,000 years ago. And her existence tells us more about the nature of the world before we were alone than almost any other single piece of evidence that has been recovered from the ground. The Denisovans are the most elusive of the species this story will visit. We know them best through what they left in living people. Through the EPAS, one variant in Tibetan lungs, and the percentage points of ancestry in Melanesian genomes, and the immune variants that may be helping people fight disease in ways they will never know, are connected to a population that lived in the caves and mountains of Asia tens of thousands of years ago. We have no face for them. No skull that has been fully described and accepted. No reconstruction that would let you look at a Denisovan the way you can look at a Neanderthal reconstruction in a natural history museum and feel the specific quality of recognition that comes from seeing something almost like yourself in a son quite yourself. That absence is its own kind of presence. Because it means that the Denisovans are, more than any other group in this story, still mostly waiting to be found. The handful of bone fragments identified so far almost certainly does not represent the full range of populations that the genetic evidence implies. A lineage that ranged from Siberia to the Tibetan Plateau to island Southeast Asia over hundreds of thousands of years left far more behind than a finger bone and a few teeth. The rest of it is still in the ground. Every year, the tools for finding them improve. Environmental DNA, extracted from cave sediments rather than from bones, has detected Denisovan genetic material in layers of Denisova Cave where no physical remains were found, suggesting that the cave holds more of their story than the bones alone have revealed. We are still learning to read the evidence they left, and the evidence is still being found. They existed. They shaped the biology of millions of people alive today. They solved problems that their descendants are still benefiting from. And we do not even know what they looked like. That combination of proven existence and near total physical mystery makes them perhaps the most haunting of all the species in this story. They are the ones who are most fully still out there, waiting, in the ground and in our genes, for the questions we have not yet learned to ask. Chapter 4. Homo floresiensis, the Hobbit of Flores. There is an island in the Indonesian archipelago called Flores. It sits in the chain of islands that stretches east from Java and Bali toward Timor and the Banda Sea. A region of dramatic volcanic geology and extraordinary biological diversity. Flores is roughly the size of the state of Connecticut. Its interior is mountainous and densely forested, cut by rivers that run fast and cold, from the central highlands down to narrow coastal plains. For most of the 20th century, it was not a place that paleoanthropologists paid particular attention to. That changed in 2003. In September of that year, a team of archaeologists, led by Peter Brown of the University of New England in Australia and Mike Morwood, working with Indonesian colleagues including Rokas Adu of the National Research and Innovation Agency of Indonesia, were excavating a cave on the western end of Flores called Liang Bua, which means cool cave in the local language. The cave is large and naturally ventilated, a place where the temperature drops noticeably from the tropical heat outside. Local people had used it for shelter and storage for generations. In the deeper layers, the team found something that none of them had been expecting. A skeleton. Small. Extraordinarily small. The individual it belonged to was an adult, based on the wear on the teeth and the fused growth plates in the bones. But the skeleton was roughly 1 meter tall, about 3 feet, 4 inches. And the skull it contained had a brain volume of approximately 380 cubic centimeters. To put that in perspective, a modern human brain averages about 1,350 cubic centimeters. The skull was smaller than the brain of Homo erectus. It was not much larger than the brain of a chimpanzee. And yet, the cave around the skeleton contained stone tools. Not crude tools, not the kind of simple flakes that might be produced accidentally. Carefully made stone tools, including small blades and points that required the same kind of multi-step planning and skilled execution as tools found at Neanderthal sites in Europe. The tools were associated with the remains of Stegodon, a now extinct relative of the elephant that was endemic to the islands of Southeast Asia. The tool makers had been hunting large animals. The team named the new species Homo floresiensis, after the island where it was found. The popular press immediately gave it a different name, drawn from the small humanoid creatures of J.R.R. Tolkien's mythology. The Hobbit. The name stuck, and while it carries an element of the whimsical that does not quite do justice to the seriousness of what was found, it captures something real about the quality of surprise that the discovery produced. Because Homo floresiensis was not what anyone had predicted would be found on a small Indonesian island in the early 21st century. The initial paper was published in October 2004 in the journal Nature, and it generated immediate and intense debate. Not all of that debate was about evolutionary significance. Some of it was about whether the find was what its discoverers claimed it to be at all. The core of the skeptical argument was this: the skeleton belonged to a modern human being who had suffered from a pathological condition that had stunted growth and reduced brain volume. The most frequently proposed condition was microcephaly, a developmental disorder in which the brain fails to grow to normal size. Other proposed conditions included cretinism, caused by iodine deficiency, and Laron syndrome, a form of growth hormone insensitivity. The debate was serious, and the skeptics were not fringe figures. What resolved it? At least for the large majority of researchers. was the accumulation of evidence from multiple directions. First, additional remains. Over subsequent excavation seasons, the team found the remains of at least 9 other individuals in Liang Bua, including bones from hands and feet, a second lower jaw, and other fragmentary remains. The multiple individuals all showed the same pattern of small body size and small brain volume. If the original skeleton had been a single pathological modern human, the probability of finding 8 or 9 more individuals with the same unusual combination of characteristics in the same cave was vanishingly small. Pathological conditions do not produce population-wide patterns. Second, the anatomy of the bones themselves. Detailed analysis of the wrist bones of Homo floresiensis, published in 2007 in the journal Science by a team including Matt Tochery of the Smithsonian Institution's Human Origins Program, found that the wrist had a structure more similar to the wrists of great apes and early hominins than to the wrists of modern humans or Homo erectus. This was not a characteristic that any known pathological condition would produce. It was a primitive retention, a feature inherited from an earlier ancestor. Third, the feet. Analysis of the foot bones, published in 2009 in the journal Nature by a team led by William Harcourt Smith of the American Museum of Natural History, found a combination of features, including very long foot bones relative to leg length, that again reflected primitive ancestry rather than pathological modification. The scientific consensus has shifted decisively toward accepting Homo floresiensis as a genuine species. Now, think about what the tools tell us. The tools found in Liang Bua and at other sites on Flores, including the site of Matameng in the central Soa Basin, where stone artifacts dating to approximately 700,000 years ago have been found, reflect planning and skill. And yet the brain that produced them was small by any standard we apply to tool-making hominins. Homo floresiensis challenges the assumption that cognitive complexity scales reliably with brain volume. Dean Falk of Florida State University and colleagues, publishing in 2005 in the journal Science, produced a virtual endocast of the Liang Bua skull and found that despite its small overall volume, the brain of Homo floresiensis showed expansion in regions associated with higher cognitive function, including areas involved in planning and attention. The brain was not simply a scaled-down version of a larger brain. It had a distinctive organization, one that apparently supported more than its size alone would suggest. Then there is the question of when they disappeared. Revised dating, published in 2016 by a team including Thomas Sutikna of the University of Wollongong and Richard Roberts, found that the Homo floresiensis remains in Liang Bua were concentrated in older sediment layers, dating to between 100,000 and 60,000 years ago. The more recent layers of the cave, from about 50,000 years ago onward, contained only modern human artifacts and remains. This revised chronology places their disappearance from Liang Bua around the time Homo sapiens was arriving in the region. Whether that timing reflects a causal connection remains an open question, and there is one more thread worth following before we leave Flores. The people of Flores have a tradition of stories about small human-like beings called Ebu Gogo. The name translates roughly as grandmother who eats anything. In these traditions, Ebu Gogo are described as small, human-like but clearly distinct from modern people, living in the forests and hills of the island. Researchers have been appropriately cautious about drawing direct connections between these traditions and Homo floresiensis. Oral traditions transform across generations, and such stories are not archaeological evidence. The Ebu Gogo traditions are not evidence that Homo floresiensis survived into recent history, and researchers are careful to say so explicitly. But the convergence, a documented species of small-bodied hominin on a specific island and a persistent local tradition of small human-like beings on that same island, is the kind of detail that sits quietly at the edge of what the evidence can resolve. Homo floresiensis is gone now. The last individuals in the population we know about died somewhere around 50,000 years ago, in the highlands and valleys of an island that they had lived on, in one form or another, for perhaps 700,000 years. They made tools and hunted stegodon and crossed water barriers that should have been impassable. They had brains smaller than our own that managed, somehow, the tasks of survival and possibly much else that we cannot yet measure. They were small and they were ancient. And they were, in the broadest sense this story can offer, human. Chapter 5. Homo luzonensis, the last to be named. Come further east. Past Flores. Pazish. Past the bed of sea. Past the chain of islands that curves northeast toward the Pacific. Come to the Philippines. To the largest island in the archipelago, Luzon, where the central highlands rise to peaks of over 9,000 feet, and the river systems run long and deep through limestone karst country that has been dissolving and reforming for millions of years. In that karst country, in a cave called Kalau, something was waiting in the rock. It would not be found until 2007. And it would not be fully understood until 2019. In 2007, a team led by Armand Salvador Mijares of the University of the Philippines began excavating new layers in Calao Cave, a site that had been known and occasionally visited by archaeologists for decades but had not been systematically explored to its deeper levels. Calao Cave is a substantial cave system, well lit near the entrance by natural light that comes through holes in the limestone ceiling, creating shafts of illumination that make it one of the more visually dramatic cave environments in Southeast Asia. In layers dating to approximately 67,000 years ago, the team found a single human foot bone, specifically the third metatarsal, a bone from the middle of the foot. It was small, clearly from a small-bodied individual, and its age made it the oldest known human fossil in the Philippines at the time of its discovery. The paper reporting the find was published in 2010 in the Journal of Human Evolution. The bone was described as belonging to a small-bodied modern human, consistent with the small body sizes seen in some living populations of the Philippines. That was the conservative interpretation. It was the appropriate interpretation given the evidence available at the time. Then the team went back. Between 2011 and 2015, Mijares and an expanded team that included Philip Piper of the Australian National University and Florent Detroit of the National Museum of Natural History in Paris returned to Calao Cave and excavated further. They found more bones, 12 additional specimens from what appeared to be at least 3 individuals, possibly more. The specimens included teeth, hand bones, foot bones, and a fragment of the upper leg bone. They were all small. They were all old. And when the team examined them carefully, comparing them to the known anatomy of every hominin species in the fossil record, they found something that the single metatarsal from 2007 had not been enough to reveal. The bones did not fit. They did not fit the anatomy of Homo sapiens. Several of the teeth were unusually small and had a cusp pattern distinct from both modern human teeth and the teeth of Homo erectus. The finger and toe bones had a curvature that in other hominins is associated with a degree of time spent in trees, not characteristic of fully modern human anatomy. The combination of features across the different skeletal elements did not match any known species. The team was careful. They assembled comparisons against every relevant hominin in the fossil record. They consulted with researchers across Europe, Australia, and the United States. They submitted their findings to the journal Nature, where the paper underwent peer review before being published in April 2019. The title was direct: A New Species of Homo from the Late Pleistocene of the Philippines. The species was named Homo luzonensis, after the island. The scientific response was cautious in exactly the way that good science is cautious when an extraordinary claim is made. Several researchers noted that the number of specimens was small, that the fragmentary nature of the remains made it difficult to be certain about the range of variation within the proposed species, and that further excavation at Callao and at other sites in the Philippines would be needed to confirm and expand the picture. These are legitimate scientific concerns. They are not dismissals. What is not seriously in question is the age of the remains or the fact that they are unusual. Something was living in Callao Cave 67,000 years ago, and possibly earlier. That was not Homo sapiens, and was not Homo erectus. Now think about how it got there. Luzon, like Flores, has never been connected to the Asian mainland by a land bridge, even during the periods of lowest sea level in the ice ages. To reach Luzon, any hominin would have had to cross open water, at minimum several tens of kilometers of it, and depending on the sea level at the time of arrival, potentially much more. The crossings happened because the hominins are there, but the how remains genuinely mysterious. One hypothesis is that the crossings were accidental, the result of individuals or small groups being swept out to sea on floating vegetation during floods or storms and washing up on islands they had no intention of reaching. This kind of rafting dispersal is documented for other animals in island Southeast Asia, and it does not require any navigational capability or intentional seafaring. Another hypothesis is that the crossings were more intentional, that the hominins involved had some form of simple watercraft. This hypothesis is harder to evaluate because watercraft made from organic materials do not preserve in the archaeological record over the timescales involved. The presence of stone tools on islands like Flores and Luzon demonstrates that hominins got there. It does not demonstrate how Armand Mijares, reflecting on the significance of the discovery, noted that the Philippines has over 7,000 islands, and that systematic archaeological investigation of the cave systems of Luzon and the other major islands has barely begun. The cave systems of the Philippine karst country are among the most extensive and least explored in Southeast Asia. What lies in the deeper layers of the other caves is almost entirely unknown. This matters because the Philippines sits at a crossroads. It is positioned between the Asian mainland to the west, island Southeast Asia to the south, and the Pacific to the east. If hominins were dispersing through this region from an early period, the Philippine archipelago would have been a staging ground, a place where populations arrived, adapted, diversified, and possibly moved on. The story of Homo luzonensis, if more evidence confirms and expands it, may ultimately tell us something not just about one small-bodied species on one island, but about the whole pattern of early human movement through the most complex island geography on Earth. There is also a question that Homo luzonensis raises in a quieter register. The species was named in 2019, not 2019 years ago, 12 years ago. In our own century, a new human species, with clear evidence of antiquity and distinct anatomy, was sitting in a cave in the Philippines throughout the entire 20th century, throughout all of its scientific and technological progress, throughout all of the expeditions to Africa and Asia and Europe that built the modern understanding of human evolution. And no one found it. Or rather, no one looked in quite the right place, in quite the right way. The discovery of Homo luzonensis is, among other things, a reminder that absence of evidence is genuinely not the same as evidence of absence. The places we have not looked thoroughly are vastly larger than the places we have. Homo luzonensis is the most recently named member of the human family. It will almost certainly not be the last. There are already hints in the ancient DNA of populations across Southeast Asia and the Pacific of ancestry that does not match any known hominin species. Signals in the genome that suggest interbreeding with populations that have not yet been identified in the fossil record. Whether those signals represent additional Denisovan populations, Homo floresiensis relatives, or something else entirely that has not yet been named and described, is a question that the evidence is not yet ready to answer. But the question is alive. It is being pursued. And the history of the past 20 years of paleoanthropology, in which the Denisovans were found in a finger bone and Homo luzonensis was found in a handful of sawarteeth and foot bones, suggests that the answers, when they come, will be surprising in ways that the existing models do not fully anticipate. The last species to be named is rarely the last species there is. The Philippines has 7,000 islands. The caves have not been fully explored, and the genomes of the people who live in those islands today carry information about the past that the bones in the ground have not yet confirmed. Somewhere in that convergence of unexplored caves and unread genomes and unasked questions, more of the story is waiting. Patient, as the past always is. Waiting for the right question, in the right place, at the right moment, to give up what it knows. Chapter 6. When they met. There is a cave in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia that has no equivalent anywhere else on Earth. Not because of its size, though it is substantial, not because of the beauty of its setting, though the Anui River valley below it is genuinely striking. A landscape of steep forested slopes and fast cold water that has the quality of somewhere that has been left alone for a long time. Denisova Cave is singular because of what its sediment layers contain. Compressed and preserved across hundreds of thousands of years of continuous occupation. The overlapping signatures of 3 different kinds of human beings, who each called it home, Neanderthals, were there. The genetic evidence from bone fragments recovered from the cave places Neanderthal occupation across multiple periods, stretching back at least 170,000 years. Denisovans were there, represented by the finger bone and the teeth and the additional fragments that subsequent excavation has revealed. And Homo sapiens was there, in the upper layers of the cave, from roughly 45,000 years ago onward. 3 kinds of human beings, 1 cave, hundreds of thousands of years. Not simultaneously in most cases. The occupations overlapped at some points and alternated at others, with periods when one group used the cave and periods when another did. The transitions visible in the changing composition of the stone tool assemblages and the animal bones left behind from different hunting traditions. But the fact that all 3 groups returned, repeatedly, to the same specific location across such an enormous span of time tells you something important about the world they shared. The cave was a resource, a place of shelter and vantage, high enough above the valley floor to provide safety, deep enough to provide warmth and dry storage, positioned well enough in the landscape to be useful as a base for the hunting and foraging that occupied most of each group's daily existence. Good resources in a variable and demanding landscape are not so common that any group with access to them would simply abandon them. The cave was worth returning to. And so, different populations, separated by time, but not by the basic logic of survival, returned to it across the generations. And sometimes the separations were not just temporal. Sometimes, the groups were there at the same time, or close enough to the same time that the encounters between them were not hypothetical but actual, played out in the valley and on the slopes, and possibly inside the cave itself. We know this because of Denny. Her story was introduced in the chapter on Denisovans. It deserves its full weight here, because it is the single most intimate piece of evidence we have for what the meetings between different hominin groups actually produced. The bone fragment catalogued as Denisova 11 was found in excavations at the cave and analyzed by Viviane Sloan, Svante Paabo, and colleagues at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology. The results, published in Nature in 2018, revealed that the fragment belonged to a female individual, a teenager based on the bone's development, whose mother was a Neanderthal and whose father was a Denisovan, not a distant relative of a Neanderthal. A Neanderthal mother. A. Denisovan father. A first-generation hybrid. Born of parents from two lineages that had diverged from each other somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 years before her birth. Let that number settle for a moment. 300,000 to 400,000 years of separation. And then, in a cave in Siberia, a meeting close enough to make a child. The further analysis of her genome revealed additional layers of complexity. Her Neanderthal mother was more closely related to Neanderthals found in Western Europe, at sites in Croatia and the Rhineland region, than to the Neanderthals known from the Altai region itself. This means her mother, or her mother's recent ancestors, had traveled. The Neanderthal population that produced Denny's mother was not local to Siberia. It had connections, through migration or through the movement of individuals, to populations thousands of kilometers to the west. Her Denisovan father carried in his own genome traces of Neanderthal ancestry from an even earlier period of interbreeding, one that had occurred hundreds of thousands of years before Denny was born. So Denny was not simply the product of two lineages meeting. She was the product of a world in which those lineages had been meeting, separating, and meeting again across an almost incomprehensible span of time. Her genome was a document written and rewritten across hundreds of thousands of years of contact between populations that modern science had spent a century assuming were entirely separate. She was one person. One teenager who died in or near a cave in Siberia approximately 90,000 years ago, and her existence tells us more about the nature of the world before we were alone than almost any other single piece of evidence that has been recovered from the ground. The question of what those meetings looked like in practice is one that the genetic evidence can gesture toward but cannot fully answer. What the evidence can tell us is the outcome. What it cannot tell us is the texture, the quality of the encounters, whether they were characterized by recognition or by fear, by curiosity or by conflict, by the gradual familiarity of groups that shared overlapping territories, or by the sudden shock of encountering something both like and unlike oneself in a landscape that both claimed. The honest answer is that we do not know, and anyone who tells you they know is reaching beyond the evidence. What we can do is look at what the evidence does show, across multiple sites and multiple time periods, and draw careful inferences about the general character of the interactions. The genetic evidence is the most informative. The pattern of Neanderthal ancestry in modern non-African humans, present at consistent levels across populations from Western Europe to East Asia and the Americas, implies that the interbreeding between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals was not a single rare event, but a recurring pattern across multiple encounters in multiple regions over an extended period of time. Researchers, including Benjamin Vernot of the Max Planck Institute and Joshua Akey, now at Princeton University, have estimated based on the distribution of Neanderthal ancestry segments in modern human genomes that the interbreeding likely occurred in multiple episodes rather than in a single ancestral population. This is not the signature of accidental or isolated encounters. It is the signature of groups that were in regular enough contact, in overlapping territories. That reproductive mixing happened as a normal consequence of proximity. The archaeological evidence adds texture to this picture, though interpreting it requires care. At several sites in Europe and the Near East, the transition from Neanderthal to modern human occupation is not a sharp boundary but a gradual one, with evidence of both populations being present in the same region during overlapping time periods. The site of Grotte du Renne in the Burgundy region of France is one of the most discussed examples. The layers associated with the Châtel-Perronian tool industry have been linked to Neanderthals based on skeletal remains found in some of the same layers. The Châtel-Perronian bears resemblances to the Aurignacian industry associated with early modern humans in Europe. And the debate over whether Neanderthals developed these behaviors independently or through contact with arriving Homo sapiens has not been fully resolved. What is clear is that the period of transition was not instantaneous. Research by William Banks of the University of Bordeaux and colleagues, published in 2008 in the journal PLOS ONE, estimated that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens were both present in Western Europe during an overlapping period. The specific duration of that overlap remains an area of active research, with subsequent studies continuing to refine the picture. What is not in dispute is that the transition took time. Generations of time. Time enough for many generations of interaction. For whatever relationships, cooperative, competitive, or simply coexistent, characterize the contact between the two groups in that landscape. The site of Vindija Cave in Croatia has provided some of the most important Neanderthal genetic material, including the specimens used in the original 2010 Neanderthal genome paper. The Vindija Neanderthals lived approximately 40,000 years ago, close in time to the period of contact with Homo sapiens in that region. Fragments of Homo sapiens ancestry have been identified in some Neanderthal genomes from this late period. The reverse signal from the Neanderthal ancestry in modern humans, suggesting that the genetic exchange went in both directions. This bidirectionality matters. It means the contacts were not simply a matter of Homo sapiens absorbing genetic material from Neanderthals while the Neanderthals themselves remained unchanged. The mixing was mutual. Children were born who had both kinds of ancestry. Communities formed that were themselves the product of mixing. Communities whose identity could not be neatly assigned to one lineage or the other. The model of two sharply bounded groups meeting and one simply replacing the other is not what the evidence shows. What the evidence shows is something messier and more human. Groups of beings living in overlapping territories, moving through the same landscapes, hunting the same animals, sheltering in some of the same caves, and sometimes across the differences of anatomy and ancestry, and whatever cultural differences existed between them, coming close enough to leave a mark on each other's lineages that tens of thousands of years of subsequent history have not erased. Outside of Denisova Cave and Western Europe, the geographic range of these interactions was wider than early research suggested. In the Levant, the region of the eastern Mediterranean that includes modern Israel, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria, Neanderthals and Homo sapiens were both present for an extended period. The caves of Mount Carmel in what is now Israel, including Kibara Cave and Kafse Cave and School Cave, have yielded remains of both groups from overlapping time periods. The pattern at these sites suggests that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens alternated occupation of the same cave systems over tens of thousands of years. The shifts probably reflecting the movement of populations in response to changing climate conditions. In China, ancient DNA analysis of specimens from a site called Tianyuan near Beijing, published by Xiaomei Fu of the Institute of Vertebrate Paleontology and Paleoanthropology in Beijing and colleagues, has found evidence of both Neanderthal and Denisovan ancestry in early modern humans from East Asia, adding another geographic dimension to the pattern of contact. The picture that emerges is not of a single frontier where Homo sapiens met the others and the encounter played out in one place. It is of a world with a permeable boundary, a boundary that shifted with the climate and with the movements of populations, across which contact and exchange occurred repeatedly, in multiple regions, over an extended period of time. And through all of this, the cave at Denisova sat in its valley, receiving whoever came to it. Neanderthals left their bones in its lower layers. Denisovans left their finger and their teeth. The hybrid girl, who carried the ancestry of both, left her bone fragment in a middle layer dated to approximately 90,000 years ago. And eventually, in the upper layers, the tools and the ornaments and the other signatures of Homo sapiens appeared. As the last of the others faded, and the world that had been shared became, for the first time, ours alone. The cave is still there. Excavation, Continues. Each season removes more sediment from layers that have not been disturbed in tens of thousands of years. Each sample of sediment, sent to the laboratory in Leipzig, contains environmental DNA that can be analyzed for the presence of hominin populations, even in layers where no physical remains have been found. The story that Denisova Cave is telling is not finished. But the part of it that has been told already, the part about the world it witnessed, is enough to change forever how we understand what it means that we are here, and that we are alone, and that the aloneness is something that happened to us rather than something that was always the natural condition of being human. We were not always alone. The cave remembers. Chapter 7. Why did they disappear? There is a man buried in a cave in what is now northern Iraq. He died tens of thousands of years ago. His community placed his body in the ground with what appears to have been deliberate care. Someone fed him for years when he could not fully feed himself. Someone kept him alive when survival was already difficult enough for those who were whole. And then, at some point, in the thousands of years that followed, everyone like him was gone. This is the question that arrives, sooner or later, at every campfire and every conference room and every quiet moment of reflection that the story of our lost relatives produces. If they were real, and they were. If they were capable, and the evidence says they were. If they were here, living full lives in the landscapes of Ice Age, Europe and Asia, and the islands of the Pacific, making tools and burying their dead and raising children who carried the ancestry of multiple lineages, then why are they gone? The honest answer, delivered plainly and without the comfort of false certainty, is that we do not fully know. What we have is a set of hypotheses, each of which explains part of the evidence and leaves part of it unexplained. What we have is a pattern of disappearance that is consistent across multiple species and multiple continents and multiple time periods, suggesting that whatever caused it was not a single local event, but something more systemic. Start with the hypothesis that generated the most popular attention and the most scientific controversy. The idea that Homo sapiens killed them. The overkill hypothesis, in its strongest form, proposes that the expansion of modern humans out of Africa and into territories occupied by other hominins and large animals resulted in a wave of extinction driven primarily by hunting. The logic is straightforward. Homo sapiens was an extraordinarily effective predator, capable of coordinated hunting strategies and long-distance projectile weapons, moving into territories occupied by beings that had no evolutionary experience of such a predator. Homo sapiens would have had an enormous advantage. The appeal of this hypothesis is its clarity. A single cause, a single agent, a clean explanation for a messy pattern. The problem is that the evidence for it, in the case of archaic hominins specifically, is almost entirely absent. There are no massacre sites, no mass graves of Neanderthal individuals showing wounds consistent with systematic human violence, no archaeological evidence of coordinated conflict between Homo sapiens and other hominins at the scale that would be required to drive a species to extinction, and the genetic evidence of interbreeding between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, which is now well established, is not consistent with a relationship characterized primarily by violent elimination. Groups that are actively trying to kill each other do not typically also have children together over an extended period across multiple geographic regions. This does not mean that violence never occurred between Homo sapiens and other hominins. It means violence as the primary driver of extinction is not supported by the evidence. The second major hypothesis focuses on competition rather than conflict. The ecological competition model proposes that Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, occupying the same landscapes and pursuing many of the same resources, were in direct competition for food, territory, and shelter, even without active violence. A more efficient competitor can drive a less efficient one toward local extinction through resource depletion and population displacement. If Homo sapiens was even marginally better at hunting, at processing plant foods, at coping with climate fluctuations, the cumulative advantage over generations would translate into population growth for Homo sapiens and population decline for Neanderthals. Without any single dramatic confrontation, research, published in 2020 by William Gilpin of the University of Arizona and colleagues, modeling the population dynamics of Neanderthal and Homo sapiens interaction using agent-based simulations, found that even a small reproductive advantage for Homo sapiens, as little as 2% higher annual survival or reproductive success, would be sufficient to drive Neanderthal populations to extinction over a period of a few thousand years. The model did not require conflict or disease or climate change. It required only a slight difference in competitive efficiency, maintained consistently over time. The third hypothesis adds a layer of complexity that neither the violence nor the competition model fully addresses. Climate change. The period between 50,000 and 30,000 years ago, when the Neanderthals disappear from the archaeological record across Europe, was not a period of stable climate. It was a period of dramatic and rapid fluctuations, oscillating between cold phases and warmer phases, with temperature changes of several degrees occurring over periods of centuries or even decades. These fluctuations had profound effects on the plant and animal communities that both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens depended on for food. Research by Christ Vason of Eindhoven University of Technology and colleagues, published in 2021 in the journal PLOS ONE, has argued that Neanderthal populations were likely small and fragmented even before the arrival of Homo sapiens in Europe, making them vulnerable to the kind of local extinction events that rapid climate fluctuations produce in small, isolated populations. The model suggests that Neanderthal populations may have been declining independently of Homo sapiens pressure, and that the arrival of modern humans simply accelerated or completed a process that was already underway. The paleoclimatic evidence is consistent with this interpretation. Periods of Neanderthal population decline in the genetic record correspond in some cases with periods of climatic deterioration. The geographic refugia, where Neanderthals held on longest, southwestern Europe, and particularly the Iberian Peninsula, are also the areas that remained most climatically stable during the periods of greatest volatility. There is a fourth hypothesis that applies specifically to the Neanderthals and that the genetic evidence has made increasingly plausible. Assimilation. If Homo sapiens and Neanderthals were interbreeding regularly across multiple regions over thousands of years, then the boundary between the two populations was not a sharp line, but a gradient. Children of mixed ancestry would have been born into communities on both sides of whatever distinctions separated the groups. Over generations, as modern human populations grew and Neanderthal populations remained small, the proportion of Neanderthal ancestry in the mixed populations would have declined toward the levels we see today, between 1 and 4%. The Neanderthals did not simply die out. Some of their genes survived by being absorbed into the expanding Homo sapiens lineage. This is not a comforting reframe designed to make extinction seem less tragic. It is a genuine scientific hypothesis, supported by the genetic evidence, that proposes a mechanism of disappearance different from either killing or simple competitive exclusion. The Neanderthals may have disappeared as a distinct population, partly because the boundaries of what counted as Neanderthal became progressively blurred through interbreeding with an expanding and ultimately much larger population. They did not all die. Some of them became us. That sentence requires care. It does not mean that Neanderthals live on, in any full sense. The populations we know as Neanderthal, with their specific anatomical characteristics and their specific cultural traditions, are gone. The individual Neanderthals, who lived in the caves of France and Spain and the Levant and Siberia, the ones who made tools and buried their dead and left markings on cave walls, they died. Their specific ways of being in the world did not survive. What survived was a fraction of their genome. carried forward in the lineages of people who were, by every meaningful measure, Homo sapiens, for Homo floresiensis. The revised dating from Liang Bua places the last known individuals at around 50,000 years ago. Approximately, when Homo sapiens was arriving in the broader region, island species are notoriously vulnerable to extinction from introduced competitors. And Homo sapiens arriving on Flores with a more efficient hunting technology than Homo floresiensis had ever encountered could have disrupted the island's ecology in ways that reduced the resources available to the small-bodied hominine. But the evidence for what actually happened on Flores is thin, and additional sites on the island, excavated more thoroughly in coming decades, may clarify the picture. For the Denisovans, the picture is less clear because the physical remains are the fewest. The genetic evidence of Denisovan ancestry in modern populations from Melanesia to Tibet suggests a long and geographically extensive history of contact with Homo sapiens. And the same combination of factors that affected the Neanderthals probably applied to the Denisovans as well, adjusted for their different geographic range and ecological circumstances. For Homo luzonensis, the honest answer is that we do not know. The truth of why they all disappeared is almost certainly a combination of factors, weighted differently for different species and different regions and different time periods. Small and fragmented populations, already stressed by climate instability. Ecological competition with arriving modern humans who were marginally but consistently more efficient across a range of survival-relevant behaviors. Genetic assimilation through interbreeding over extended contact periods. And, possibly, localized episodes of direct conflict that, while not the primary driver, contributed to population decline in specific regions. Complex systems do not collapse from single causes. They collapse when multiple stresses arrive simultaneously, and their combined effect exceeds the system's capacity to absorb them. The world that supported multiple kinds of human beings was a complex system. It depended on specific climate conditions, specific resource distributions, specific population sizes, and geographic arrangements. When those conditions changed, the system was stressed. The arrival of Homo sapiens, expanding out of Africa with a set of cognitive and cultural tools that gave it advantages across a range of environments, was one more stress added to a system that was already under pressure. The others could not absorb all of it. We could, and that asymmetry. Not any single dramatic confrontation or any deliberate campaign of elimination may be the closest answer the evidence currently allows. It is not a comfortable answer, but it may be the most honest one we have. The question deserves to stay open, not because the evidence is not real, but because the evidence is still accumulating. Each new excavation season, each new ancient genome, each new application of a new analytical technique has the potential to complicate and deepen the picture. The past is not finished speaking, and the man buried in the cave in northern Iraq, the one who could not fully care for himself and was cared for anyway, deserves at least this much: the acknowledgement that his disappearance from this world was not simple, was not clean, and was not inevitable. It was the end of something that had taken hundreds of thousands of years to build, and it left a silence that we are still learning to hear. Chapter 8. What they left inside us. There is a version of this story that ends with absence. The Neanderthals are gone. The Denisovans are gone. Homo floresiensis and Homo luzonensis are gone. The world that was shared became a world that belongs to one lineage alone. And the others exist now only as bones in caves and fragments of ancient DNA and the fading memory of what it meant to share a planet with other kinds of people. That version is true, as far as it goes, but it does not go far enough. Because the others are not entirely gone. They left something behind that is more intimate than bones and more durable than stone tools. Something that has been traveling forward through time in the most personal of all possible vehicles. They left themselves inside us. Not as memory, not as story, not as the kind of legacy that requires someone to remember and transmit it from generation to generation. As biology. As the literal molecular inheritance of encounters that happened tens of thousands of years ago, encoded in the genomes of billions of people alive today, doing quiet work in living bodies that the people who carry it almost never know about. This is not a metaphor. It is one of the most precisely documented findings in modern science. Begin with the immune system. The human immune system is extraordinarily complex, but one of its most important components is a set of proteins encoded by a region of the genome called the human leukocyte antigen system, abbreviated as HLA. The HLA system is responsible for presenting fragments of pathogens, bacteria and viruses and parasites, to the immune cells that recognize and attack them. The more diverse your HLA variants, the broader the range of pathogens your immune system can recognize and respond to. HLA diversity is immunological wealth. Research published in 2011 in the journal Science by Laurent Abbé-Rocht of the Marseille-Nice Genomics Institute and colleagues found that several HLA variants present in modern human populations at high frequencies were derived from Neanderthal and Denisovan ancestry. Some of these variants are extremely common. One Neanderthal-derived HLA variant is present in more than 50% of people of European and Asian ancestry. Another Denisovan-derived HLA variant reaches frequencies of over 90% in some populations of Papua New Guinea. Sit with those numbers for a moment. These are not trace remnants that natural selection has been slowly eliminating over the generations. They are variants that natural selection has actively maintained at high frequency because they work. They help the immune system do its job. When the ancestors of modern Europeans and Asians moved into territories that Neanderthals had occupied for hundreds of thousands of years, those territories came with their own populations of pathogens, microorganisms that had been evolving in the bodies of the local hominins and against which the arriving Homo sapiens had no prior immunity. The Neanderthal HALA variants, acquired through interbreeding, gave the arriving populations a head start on recognizing and responding to at least some of those pathogens. Think about what that means for a moment. The Neanderthals had been living in those landscapes long enough to develop immune responses to what lived there. They shared those responses, in the most literal, biological sense, with the people who came after them, through the children of encounters that neither side could have understood in those terms. That is not nothing. That is, depending on how you hold it, one of the more remarkable things that has ever happened between two different kinds of beings on this planet. The skin and hair are another domain where Neanderthal genetic contributions are well documented. Multiple research groups, including work published by Sriram Sankararaman of the University of California, Los Angeles, and colleagues in 2014 in the journal Nature, have identified Neanderthal-derived gene variants that affect the production of keratin, the structural protein that forms skin, hair, and nails. These variants influence the properties of the skin barrier in ways that may have been adaptive for populations moving into the colder and more variable climates of Europe and Asia. The Neanderthals were already adapted to those environments. The specific variants that suited their skin and hair to cold conditions were passed on and retained in the modern human populations that moved into the same environments. Let that land. You may be sitting somewhere tonight in a climate far colder than where your deepest ancestors began. The skin that keeps you warm, that maintains its integrity in dry winter air, may be doing its work partly because of a gene that was shaped in a Neanderthal body in Ice Age, Europe, tens of thousands of years before you were born. Blood clotting is another area where Neanderthal gene variants appear in modern human genomes, though the story here is more nuanced. Several Neanderthal-derived variants affecting blood coagulation have been identified in European populations. Some of these variants appear associated with increased clotting tendency, which may have been advantageous in environments where wound infection was a significant cause of mortality. The relationship between ancient gene variants and modern health outcomes is a complex and active area of research, influenced by many interacting factors. And any questions about personal health are best discussed with a medical professional. What the research illustrates, in a broader sense, is that the environment in which a gene variant is useful can be very different from the environment in which we live today. The Denisovan genetic contributions tell a parallel story with different geographic emphases. The PLOS ONE variant carried by Tibetan populations, discussed in the chapter on Denisovans, is the clearest and most dramatic example. Researchers, including Rasmus Nielsen of the University of California, Berkeley, and Emilia Huerta Sanchez, publishing in 2014 in Nature, documented how Denisovans living across the high-altitude landscapes of Central Asia for hundreds of thousands of years had developed through natural selection a version of the PLOS ONE gene that allowed them to function at high altitude. When the ancestors of modern Tibetans interbred with Denisovans, they acquired that variant. Natural selection maintained it, because in the specific environment of the Tibetan plateau, it worked. The Denisovans are not alive, but their solution to the problem of living at altitude is alive, running in the bodies of millions of people on the Tibetan plateau every day. Additional Denisovan-derived gene variants affecting energy metabolism and fat storage in high-altitude populations were identified by Kelsey Witt of the University of Illinois and colleagues, publishing in 2019. The Denisovan legacy in Tibetan biology is not limited to a single gene. It is a suite of adaptations, developed over hundreds of thousands of years of high-altitude living, that passed into the modern human lineage through interbreeding and was subsequently maintained by natural selection. In Melanesian populations, research on immune function variants with possible Denisovan origins has been conducted by multiple teams examining the high Denisovan ancestry populations of Papua New Guinea and surrounding archipelagos. This is an active area of research, and the full picture of Denisovan immune contributions to Melanesian biology is still being assembled. What is established is that these populations carry Denisovan ancestry at levels of 4 to 6%, and that understanding what that ancestry does biologically is a meaningful scientific question that researchers are actively pursuing. Then there is the brain. And here the story requires the most careful handling. Several Neanderthal-derived gene variants have been identified that are expressed in the developing brain. Research by Hugo Zeberg of the Karolinska Institute in Sweden and Svante Pääbo, published in 2020 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, identified a Neanderthal-derived set of gene variants on chromosome 3 that affects the expression of genes involved in cell development across multiple tissue types during the coronavirus pandemic of 2020. This particular variant was studied in the context of severe illness. A statistical association was observed in a large dataset, with carriers of this Neanderthal-derived variant showing higher rates of severe outcomes in one specific study. This association has been the subject of subsequent research aimed at understanding the underlying mechanism. It is one data point in a complex and still developing scientific picture. It does not mean that having Neanderthal ancestry increases your personal health risk in any straightforward way. And any health concerns are always best discussed with a medical professional. What the finding illustrates is something this chapter has been building toward from the beginning. The genetic legacy of the archaic hominins is not an abstract historical curiosity. It is a living influence on the biology of billions of people, interacting with the diseases and environments of the 21st century in ways that researchers are still working to understand. It is a connection that runs deeper than any story or monument or written record. It runs in the blood. It runs in the immune response. It runs in the lungs of people living at altitude on the Tibetan plateau, doing work that a population we discovered in a finger bone made possible. There is one more dimension worth sitting with before this chapter closes. The gene variants inherited from Neanderthals and Denisovans are not randomly distributed across the human genome. There are also large regions of the modern human genome that contain almost no Neanderthal-derived sequence. Regions that appear to have been systematically cleared by natural selection over the tens of thousands of years since the interbreeding occurred. Research by Sankararaman and colleagues has identified that some of the genomic regions most depleted of Neanderthal ancestry are associated with male fertility and with brain development. This suggests that hybrids between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals may have experienced some degree of reproductive incompatibility, a pattern seen in other cases of hybridization between closely related but genetically divergent species. The Neanderthal contributions to modern human genomes that survived are the ones that were compatible. The ones that caused incompatibility were removed. The result is what we carry today: a genome that is overwhelmingly Homo sapiens in its architecture, carrying within it a small but functionally significant set of contributions from the others. Contributions that have been tested by tens of thousands of years of natural selection and retained because they were useful. We are the survivors of a world that had multiple kinds of human beings, and the others survive in us, quietly, in the parts that have proven their worth. Chapter 9. The silence they left behind. There is a particular quality of silence that surrounds the others now. Not the silence of things that never existed. Not the silence of myth or imagination. The silence of things that were entirely real, entirely present, entirely alive in the world, and are now gone in a way that leaves almost nothing of the inner life they must have had. We know the shape of the Neanderthal hand. We know the volume of their brain case. We know the isotope ratios in their teeth that reveal what they ate and where they grew up. We know the gene variants they carried that helped their descendants fight infection and regulate their skin's response to cold. We know the cave in Siberia where a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father had a daughter 90,000 years ago. And we know more about that daughter's genome than we know about the genomes of most people who lived 300 years ago. What we do not know is what any of them called themselves. We do not know the name of a single Neanderthal. Not one. Out of the hundreds of thousands, possibly millions, of individuals who lived across the 400,000 years or more of Neanderthal existence, not one name has survived. Not because they certainly had no names. Most researchers who study Neanderthal cognition and social behavior consider it plausible that some form of communication, possibly including elements we might recognize as language, was present in Neanderthal communities. The evidence is indirect, but real. The complexity of coordinated hunting that their prey animals required. The maintenance of tool-making traditions across generations that implies the transmission of learned skills. The social structures that burial practices suggest. All of these things would have been significantly easier with structured communication than without it. But we cannot prove they had language. We cannot recover a word they spoke. The hyoid bone. The small curved bone in the throat that supports the muscles of speech, has been found in at least one Neanderthal individual, from Kebara Cave in Israel, and it is structurally similar to the human hyoid, suggesting that the physical apparatus for speech was present. Whether that apparatus was used to produce something we would recognize as language in any full sense is a question the bone cannot answer. The silence around Neanderthal language is total. And the silence around Neanderthal music is nearly total, with one extraordinary and still contested exception. In a cave called Divya Baba in Slovenia, in a layer of sediment associated with Neanderthal occupation and dated to approximately 60,000 years ago, a fragment of cave bear femur was found in 1995 with 2 complete holes and the remnants of 2 more on its surface. Ivan Turk, of the Slovenian Academy of Sciences and Arts, proposed that the holes were made deliberately, that the bone was a flute. The claim generated immediate and sustained controversy. Critics argued that the holes were made by the teeth of carnivores, gnawing on the bone, rather than by any deliberate hand. A detailed analysis, published in 2023 by Turk and colleagues, examined the holes with new microscopic and experimental methods, and concluded that the evidence continued to support deliberate manufacture. The debate has not been fully resolved. The scientific community remains divided. If the Divjay bone is a flute, it is the oldest known musical instrument in the world, and it was made by a Neanderthal. If it is not, then the musical life of the Neanderthals, whatever it consisted of, left no trace that we have yet recovered. The silence is not proof of absence, but it is silence. What the archaeological record does preserve is evidence pointing toward an inner life, even if it cannot describe that inner life directly. Go back to Shanidar Cave. Go back to the individual called Shanidar I. He had a withered arm. He had healed fractures across his body. He had severe arthritis and signs of a blow to the head that may have affected his sight and his hearing. He survived to old age in one of the most demanding survival environments that human beings have ever navigated. He could not have done it alone. Someone chose to keep him alive. Not once. Not in a single moment of generosity. But across years. Across seasons of hunting and gathering and moving camp and everything else that survival in the Ice Age landscape required, someone decided, every day, that he was worth the extra effort. We will never know what word they used for that decision. We will never know if they had a word for it at all. But the decision was made. It is written in the bones. And something in that fact, in the simple stubbornness of a community that kept a diminished member alive across years of difficulty, feels less like evolutionary biology and more like something that does not have a clean scientific name. We know similar things about Neanderthal ornaments. The eagle talons and the pierced shells and the pigment-stained objects are evidence of attention to appearance and adornment, of the kind of symbolic thinking that assigns meaning to objects beyond their purely practical function, whether that symbolic thinking extended to narrative, to the telling of stories about the past or the future or the nature of the world, is unknown. We cannot hear their stories. We cannot know their names for the animals they hunted, or the rivers that provided water, or the mountain passes that connected one valley to the next. We cannot know the words they may have used to describe grief or joy, or the particular quality of light on a winter morning. All of that is gone. The Denisovans are even more silent than the Neanderthals. We have almost no physical remains. We have no burial sites attributable to them. We have a genome, detailed and informative in what it tells us about ancestry and population history and the gene variants that were passed to their descendants. We have almost nothing that tells us about the texture of a Denisovan life. What the genome does tell us is that Denisovans had the same basic human biology, the same developmental programs, the same physiological systems that we have. They grew from infants to children to adults. They got sick and recovered, or did not recover. They ate and slept and moved through landscapes that were, for them, home. Those landscapes are gone now too. The Central Asian steppes and mountain ranges where the Denisovans lived have changed beyond recognition over 50,000 years of climate shifts. The specific rivers and valleys and cave systems where Denisovan communities spent their lives are not recoverable from the genetic evidence alone. They are simply gone. Homo floresiensis left behind a slightly different kind of silence. The island of Flores is still there. The cave of Liang Bua is still there. Still being excavated. Still yielding information about the deep past of the island and its inhabitants. But the living tradition that might have connected the bones in the cave to a human story, the language, the knowledge of plants and animals, the oral tradition of the people who lived there for 700,000 years, has been absent for so long that even the possibility of recovering it is not seriously entertained. 700,000 years. Think about that number for a moment. Homo floresiensis, or the lineage that became Homo floresiensis, was on Flores for longer than our species has existed anywhere. They were there before Homo sapiens existed. They were there when Homo sapiens was just beginning to emerge in Africa. They were there through ice ages and warm periods and volcanic eruptions and the evolution and extinction of the stegodon herds they hunted, and they left no story that we can read. Only the bones. There is something in this silence that is worth holding without trying to resolve it. The instinct, when confronted with a gap in knowledge, is to fill it, to project, to assume that because the others were human-like in their anatomy and their behaviors, their inner lives must have been recognizably similar to ours. Or, in the opposite direction, to assume that because they were different from us in their anatomy, their inner lives must have been dim and barely conscious. Both of those instincts are errors. The honest position is that we do not know what a Neanderthal felt when they placed a body in the earth. We do not know what a Denisovan experienced when they looked out from a high mountain pass at the landscape spread below them. We do not know what it was like to be Homo floresiensis, small and strong and ancient, navigating the forests of Flores in a body that had been shaped by 700,000 years of island adaptation. We do not know. And the not knowing is the most honest thing we can say about the silence they left behind. What we can say, with confidence, is that they were here, that the world was richer for their presence, that the landscapes they moved through and the caves they sheltered in and the animals they hunted were all part of a world that contained more kinds of consciousness than the world contains now. That the narrowing of the human story to a single surviving lineage represents a loss whose full dimensions we may never be able to measure. The silence is not empty. It is full of lives that were lived completely and are now completely gone. And the fact that we are trying, with every tool available to us, to hear something in that silence, to recover even the smallest fragment of what those lives contained, says something about what kind of beings we are. We are the kind that cannot leave the silence alone. We keep listening, even when the silence does not answer. Chapter 10. We are the survivors of a crowded world. Come back to the present, not to the caves of Siberia or the limestone gorges of Slovenia or the volcanic highlands of Flores. Come back to wherever you are right now. In the dark, in the quiet. With the weight of this story settling around you, like sediment in still water. You are here. That is not a small thing. The world that produced you was not a world designed to produce you. It was not moving toward you as its inevitable destination. It was a world of contingency and variation, and the constant pressure of environments that could not be predicted. And the outcome it reached. The single surviving lineage of human beings that now covers every habitable surface of the earth, was one of many possible outcomes. Not the only one. Not the necessary one. But the one that happened. You are a survivor. Not in the sense of having personally endured something catastrophic. Though the lineage that produced you has endured a great deal. In the sense that every generation between you and the first Homo sapiens who walked out of Africa had to survive long enough to reproduce, had to navigate the specific challenges of their specific moment in the specific landscape they occupied, and had to pass on the inheritance that eventually, through an unbroken chain of individual lives and individual choices and individual strokes of luck, became you. That chain includes the others, not as the main thread, not as the dominant ancestry, but as the contributions that were woven in at specific points and that have traveled forward ever since in the fabric of what we are. The Neanderthal gene variant that may be helping your immune system right now. The Denisovan contribution to the oxygen metabolism of Tibetan lungs at altitude. The HLA variants that give populations in Melanesia a broader immunological toolkit than they would have had without the Denisovan ancestry carried in some of those communities. The others are in this with us, quieter than they were, but present. 30 years ago, the story of human evolution was a story about progress. A linear narrative in which increasingly capable hominins replaced their predecessors each one more behaviorally complex than the last, until Homo sapiens arrived at the endpoint and inherited the Earth by right of cognitive superiority. In that story, the Neanderthals were a failed experiment. The Denisovans did not yet exist as a recognized entity, and the little people of Flores had not been found. That story is gone now. Not because the science was dishonest. The science was doing what science does, building the best available model from the available evidence and revising it as new evidence appeared. The story changed because the evidence changed. The Neanderthal genome revealed interbreeding where replacement had been assumed. The Denisovan fingerbone revealed an entirely unknown lineage where a simpler picture had seemed sufficient. The bones from Liangbua revealed a small-bodied toolmaker where conventional models had predicted either modern humans or nothing. The new story is more complicated than the old one. It is also more true. And in being more true, it raises questions that the old story did not have to answer. If we are not the inevitable endpoint of a progressive narrative, then what are we? If the Neanderthals were not inferior to us but different from us, in ways that were not deficiencies but alternative adaptations to alternative environments, then what is the meaning of their disappearance? If the world was richer when it contained multiple kinds of human beings, and it is poorer now that it contains only one, what does that say about the trajectory of the world we are building? These are not comfortable questions, but they are honest ones. A world with multiple kinds of human beings was a world with multiple cognitive approaches to the problems of survival, multiple sets of adaptations to multiple environments, multiple immune systems, each shaped by long residence in specific landscapes, multiple ways of making tools and organizing communities and transmitting knowledge across generations. That diversity was a form of resilience. We are the last of those experiments. We carry, in our genomes, the contributions of the others, but the others themselves are gone. The diversity of human approaches to existence has been reduced to one, and that reduction represents a narrowing that has no precedent in the history of the genus Homo. This is not an argument for despair. It is an observation about what was lost and what was retained, and about the responsibilities that come with being the sole surviving member of a once crowded family. The science of ancient genomics is still young. Every year, the techniques for extracting and analyzing ancient DNA become more sensitive, more capable of recovering information from older and more degraded samples. Sedimentary ancient DNA is opening access to genetic information from periods and places where physical remains are too fragmentary to yield a genome by conventional methods. Ancient protein analysis is extending the reach of molecular paleontology back beyond 1 million years. Machine learning algorithms are being applied to the genomic data of living populations across the world, searching for signals of ancient interbreeding with populations that have not yet been named or described in the fossil record. The signals are there. Researchers have identified what appears to be a deeply divergent, archaic ancestry component in some African populations, distinct from Neanderthal or Denisovan, described in papers published from 2020 onward by teams including work led by Arun Durvasula and Sriram Sankararaman at the University of California, Los Angeles. This is a preliminary and actively debated area of research. The source population has not been identified in the fossil record. What it suggests, carefully and without overclaiming, is that the story of archaic hominin diversity may be even larger than the current evidence describes. The world before we were alone may have been more crowded than we currently know, and they are waiting to be found. In a cave that has not yet been excavated, in a bone that has not yet been analyzed, in a layer of sediment that the right technique will eventually be able to read. Now let this settle. You have traveled through the deep past of our species and its lost relatives tonight. You have sat with the silence they left and the genes they passed on and the questions their existence raises about what it means to be human. Perhaps what you carry out of this is simply this: the word human is larger than we thought. It was always larger than we thought. Even when we did not know about the Denisovans or the little people of Flores or the complex genomic legacy of the interbreeding that happened in the caves of Europe and the mountains of Asia, the word was always pointing at something more varied and more interesting than the single surviving lineage implied. And now that we know, even partially, about the others, the word has expanded to include them. They were in the world with us, and for a few thousand years, in the overlap between their long histories and our expanding one, they were in some of the same valleys and caves and river crossings with us, close enough for the encounters that changed all of our genomes. That proximity is still inside you. The Neanderthal HLA variant that may be running in your immune system right now was made in a Neanderthal body, tested against the pathogens of Ice Age Europe across thousands of generations of Neanderthal lives, and passed to you through a chain of bodies that stretches back to an encounter between two kinds of human beings who recognized something in each other and came close. What they recognized, we cannot know. What they passed forward, we can measure, and the fact that we can measure it at all says something worth noticing. We are a species that refuses to leave the silence alone. We dig through rubble. We sequence degraded DNA from cave sediment. We apply new tools to old questions. We do all of this because we feel, at some level that precedes the decision to feel it, that the others matter, that their stories matter, that the silence they left is not an acceptable ending. They were here, and we are here, and between those two facts is the whole of this story. Not a story about loss, though there is loss in it, real and irreducible, and worth acknowledging without flinching. A story about connection, about the specific, molecular, measurable connection between the beings who are gone and the people who remain. About the fact that extinction is not always total, that lineages can end as distinct populations while leaving something of themselves in the populations that continue. Somewhere tonight, in a cave in Siberia, or a karst valley in the Philippines, or a limestone gorge in France, there is a bone in the ground that has not yet been found. A fragment of a life that was lived completely, tens of thousands of years ago, in a world that was crowded with different kinds of human beings. A bone that carries, in its ancient proteins or its degraded DNA, information that will change the story again when someone finally finds it. The story is not finished. The world before alone is still being discovered. Let your breathing slow. Let the weight of the past settle around you like sediment in still water. And know that you carry, in the quietest part of your biology, something that was given to you by beings whose names we will never know. In a world that no one alive has ever seen. It is still with you. It always was. Good night.